last week. Of course, as you remember, we're into the point now where Jesus has been arrested. He's been betrayed by Judas. Judas, in the early parts of chapter 27, the Bible says, goes out and hangs himself over his guilt and his remorse over what he's done. As he said, he betrayed the innocent blood. We also see the fact that though he was guilt-stricken, though he was sorry, though he was depressed and broken about the things that he had done, it still didn't bring him to a point where he was willing to come to the Lord and repent to the Lord for his sin, and Judas winds up going to hell instead. And even though Peter would deny Jesus as well, and just as vehemently, Peter comes back to the Lord and repents to the Lord himself, and there's an obvious different outcome for him. And so as chapter 27 drags on, Jesus is in front of first the Sanhedrin court, which would have been the Jewish court. They rush him in the early part of chapter 27 to hold this, what it amounts to an illegal trial. As I mentioned before, they really didn't do it the way that their law laid out for them to do it. They don't have the power of crucifixion or death in general. They can't pass a death sentence, so they push Jesus over to Pilate, who, after examining Jesus several times now, as we've looked at, becomes more and more aware and able to discern that Jesus is really not guilty of a crime. And it even says the fact that he knows and understands that the Jews have put Jesus into this and are seeking to have him killed just simply because of envy for who Jesus is. He's stealing their congregation, and he's gained a following of people, and they kind of liked having that position. And so Pilate tries several times to try to get out of doing what they keep demanding that he do, and they of course stir the people up. And in verse 22, and we read this last week, I'm just going back through this to set the stage. Pilate here is on the judgment seat, and he's saying to the people, after they have said, we don't want you to release Jesus. If you remember, it was customary at this time of Passover for the Romans to release one prisoner that the Jews selected as kind of an olive branch of peace. There was constant turmoil really between the Jewish people and the Roman government. Though Rome really, if you look at it, was pretty kind to a lot of the nations that they conquered. Now, they were a ruthless people when it came to taking over nations, but really after they took it over, they tended to kind of just let the society do. And if you see even the Jews, they were able to worship in their temple. They were able to conduct their sacrifices. So Rome didn't really suppress or oppress them religiously all that much. It was a fairly free society, and so they really didn't have it all that bad, but they didn't like being under Roman rule or authority, and they were constantly causing uprisings and sedition and that sort of thing. And eventually that's what led to the 70 AD massacre of the Jews. But anyway, we don't go back through that. But after they say, we don't want Jesus released, we want Barabbas, because you remember Pilate puts these two up there and says, which one do you want? The most notable criminal that Pilate has at this time, he's a murderer, he's a robber, he's guilty of treason and sedition, he's not a great guy. And Pilate is hoping, and that's where I was trying to go with that, Pilate's doing everything he knows how to do to try to keep from having to crucify Jesus, because it's his order that's going to have to be given. The Jews don't have the ability to force it and to say to do it. It's ultimately Pilate's that has to do. And Pilate asked this question, and I kind of skipped over it last week in touching on some other stuff, but he says to them, what shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ? And now I don't think Pilate understood how profound of a question that is, but if you look at it from a scriptural standpoint, that question right there is really the defining question that every human being that ever lives, ever walks the planet is going to have to answer. What do I do with Jesus? Because of who Jesus was, because of who Jesus claimed to be, and because of what Jesus did, it causes everybody that is ever born to have to answer that question. Now there's some that choose to ignore, there's some that choose to just not worry about it, not deal with the question, but ultimately the question has to be answered by everyone. And in the scenario that plays out, you really get a perspective from a lot of different viewpoints. There's those that are what I would call the ignorant that we will see, meaning they don't know anything about who Jesus is. I think you see that like in the Roman soldiers that are going to come in. Those Roman soldiers didn't know who Jesus was. They don't know anything about the Jewish Messiah and all of the prophecies, and they're ignorant of what's going on, really. There's the religious evil that's there, that the Jews in their religious sanctimony or choose not to acknowledge Jesus as Messiah and rather go on. And as Jesus said in one place, he says, you have exchanged the righteousness of God and gone out to seek and to make your own form of righteousness. And I'm paraphrasing there, but that's one of the things that they did. But that question right there is important. And so, and of course they all said that were there, let him be crucified. And again, the governor, and this is the point of the story that we left off last week. Pilate in verse 24 saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, an uprising. It's bordering on a riot at this point in time. And as I mentioned, Pilate had already been on thin ice for some things that he had caused and was in serious trouble if this got out of hand, and they had to send in soldiers again to squelch this goings on. And so he symbolically, and this is the story of Pilate that most of us remember. They bring him out the basin of water, and Pilate symbolically, and this was something that they would have understood in their culture, washes his hands in the basin and says, I'm innocent of the blood of this, of this innocent man, or of this just person. Pilate did not want to crucify Jesus, as we mentioned last week. And it goes on to say here in Matthew, and Matthew's story is somewhat concise when it comes to all of this, and you really have to read all the Gospels to fill it in. The people that answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. And then he released Barabbas. Barabbas gets to walk free in this. And when he had scourged Jesus, it says, he delivered him to be crucified. And of course, that process and that right there is more than just that word can imply in our minds. That was a very, very brutal process. Now, as you remember, the cat of nine tails and the way that they treated people, and of course we understand and know that it was to a point. Some people talk about the fact that he got beaten 40 times. That was a Jewish tradition, that they were only allowed to smite you with anything 40 times, so they always did 39 just to make sure. That's why Paul said he was beaten of the Jews on several occasions 39 times, or 40 stripes save one. That was their typical way of doing that. The Jews the Romans had no custom. They didn't, they just went till they got tired of doing it. So just understand that's something that's known. And they delivered him to be crucified. And that's really pretty glossed over from Matthew's viewpoint. There's others that cover the things that go on here considerably more. And John, we read this last week, and I'm hurrying to get to where we pick up. But Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on a purple robe. And they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And Pilate here, and this is the point I wanted to get to, Pilate again brings him forth. So it's not just a streamline push him through. Pilate is actively seeking. In fact, the verses following this says, from that point Pilate sought to release Jesus. He was trying to figure out a way to get out of crucifying Jesus. He said that I may bring him forth again. This is about the fourth time that Pilate's put him out there. Told everybody there, look, I do not find anything wrong. I can't find a single crime. I don't find anything worthy of death. He said it several different ways. He's innocent. I'm washing my hands of it. I want you to handle it. And they wouldn't let it go. The Jews were so dead set on killing Jesus at this point in time. They were willing to riot. They were willing to risk the Romans sending soldiers in, which would have happened if they had continued rioting about it. They were willing to risk it all to force Pilate, because again, he's the one that ultimately has to give the order to have Jesus crucified. And so back in Matthew, the soldiers of the governor, and this is new verses here, took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. So now this is after he scourged him. This is again, they take him back into the common hall. They stripped him down, and this is as embarrassing as it gets. I mean, this is real and this is raw. This is what happened. These are not happy verses, but this is the most necessary part of Scripture for us as human beings. But they stripped him and put on him a scarlet or a purple robe. And when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and they put a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him. Now understand, this is all dripping in sarcasm and mockery. This is not them being kind to Jesus. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. In other words, oh yeah, you're a king. Yeah, this is real impressive. They're making fun of him. And again, these Roman soldiers probably know nothing about who Jesus is. Most of the stuff that he's done, they would have been fairly disconnected from the society that the Lord.
A little bit from little.
Exactly. Yeah.
They do.
Look, this is what natural man does.
Yeah.
When natural man is left to himself.
That's what I was.
These men have nothing against Jesus. Mm-hmm. And yet look at how evil and how horrible they treat somebody they don't even really know or understand. It goes to show you that when there are no rules and when there is no oversight and man is allowed to let his mind do whatever he wants to do, it shows how far human beings can go in their cruelty and in the way that they deal with other human beings. Again, these men have heard Pilate say what he said. That he finds no fault in him, that there's really nothing wrong, that he's not worthy of death, and they're still doing what they're doing to the Lord. And they mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. And that was, yeah, I mean, this was their job. This was what they did. They got a kick out of it. I guess, I don't know. This is...
It's probably like their entertainment.
Mm-hmm. And so, again, this is the path that we're headed down now. And, ultimately... As we mentioned last week, it's ultimately Pilate. Now, he can say he's innocent of Jesus' blood. He can say that it's not, it's not him. But as we mentioned last week, just keep in mind, ultimately it's him that has to say the words, away with him, crucify him. The order has to come out of Pilate's mouth, and it did. His hand was forced. And when it came down to it, giving up all the comfort and all the power that Pilate had versus letting an innocent man go that he knew needed to be released, Pilate picked himself. And again, for perspective, what shall I do with Jesus? Some people get to that point and they just can't give up their life and their loves in this world. and sacrifice anything for the Lord. And so it says here, and again, this is just harsh reality when it comes to this. It says, and they spit upon him and took the reed, verse 30, and smote him on the head. This is after they platted the crown of thorns. So they're smacking him over the head with the reed, and they're beating on him, and they've spit in his face, and they're mocking him.
Pulled his beard out.
Exactly. All of this has happened. He's really just, and I mean, there's no need to go too far in the explanation of all of this. I think we all understand the brutality of the cross. The Romans had devised their system of torture and crucifixion to be as painful and as agonizing as humanly possible. Now, really and truly, we haven't even gotten to the crucifixion part. This is just the way that they dealt with people. And most people, whether or not they eventually were crucified at this point, would have succumbed and died from the injuries that you sustained anyway. I mean, because of the way things were in the ancient world, when you got opened up that much and got beaten that much, chances of infection and but that's all beside the point. But just understand, all of this is just brutality at its worst. And by this point in time, when they put his own raiment back on him here in verse 31 and led him away to be crucified, he's basically walking meat. I mean, he has been so brutalized and so beaten by this point in time that he is really, and of course the Bible describes it in the Old Testament prophecies, that you could hardly recognize him at this point as even being human. And it's again, I'm not doing it for theatrics. I'm just letting you know. The most important and the most impressive part of all of this is to always keep in mind that this is completely his choice. There's not a moment in time in any of this. Now think about it. Think about our human nature. They're spitting in his face. There's not a moment in time where he can't say, stop. He could end this at any point in time. It is only his love for us that the Bible says that he endured the cross, despising the shame. It's all of this is done so that you and I would have a way to be saved. This is absolutely 100% necessary if any of us are ever going to be saved. And he knows that the whole time. It says they led him away to crucify him, and as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, and him they compelled to carry his cross. By this time, and of course it talks about the fact that he stumbled under the weight of the cross. By this time he is so weakened, and they're asking him to carry, which was typical of these criminals, to carry his own cross. Now, there's always been the discussion, was it the whole cross? Was it just the cross beam? Don't know, doesn't matter. Either way it was heavy. It was rough timber, and it doesn't matter. By this point in time, he's been so weakened and so emptied of energy that he just simply can't continue. And lest anybody think that he's weak, or, I personally believe that Jesus was the absolute epitome of human endurance and ability. Because remember, his body wasn't touched or marred by sin. Okay? And so I think he exuded all of the strength that it is possible for a man to exude by the time that you get to this point. Again, I don't think most people would have made it and survived to this point. But regardless, they found this man named Simon, and we'll talk about him maybe more later. It's not so important as the main storyline is right here. And him they compelled to bear his cross. So they basically pulled somebody from the crowd and made him, this was again, the Romans had the power to do whatever they wanted to, and they made him carry the cross of Jesus to the place that he would be crucified. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, now the other Gospels also call it Calvary, it's just the difference in Aramaic and Latin. The Golgotha is Aramaic, Calvary is Latin. It's both for the same place. It says, and this is to say, a place of a skull. And this this is in reference to apparently the way that that area looked. If you looked at it from a distance, apparently Mount Calvary actually looked like a human skull from a distance because of the way the topography was shaped. Now, there's a lot of people that say it's here or there, over there in the Middle East right now in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem. I don't know if you can prove any of it. It's kind of like the tomb and so many of the places that they talk about over there. You know, I don't know. I don't think it's important. The different ones have built different shrines and, you know, things over there. I think, truth be told, I think it's probably intentional on the Lord's part that most of that stuff has been lost to history, just because I don't think he really intends for us to worship a place on earth. It's not, don't get me wrong, this is God's plan and it's happening exactly when and where God wanted it to happen. But it wasn't important where the cross was, it was important who was on it. And so the fact that we don't know all of that stuff, I don't think is an accident, because it's the Lord that we worship, and there's no spot on planet Earth that you can go to and be closer to God than you are when you fellowship with the Lord in your own heart. The Bible says that He lives within us, and so a lot of people like to make pilgrimages to the Middle East and stuff like that. I personally don't find it necessary. I believe that Jesus is as real as I could possibly imagine, and I don't need to see the tomb that's empty. I don't need to see Mount Calvary to know exactly what happened. And so it's honestly not that important to me. It is to some. But this is the place that they bring him to. It's the place of a skull. And typically, all of your renditions and video and movies of this show this taking place on the very pinnacle of a high hill up in, above it. That probably wasn't the case. It was probably down much lower, and there was probably still mountain above him. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But it says here in verse 34 that they gave him vinegar to drink mingled with gall, and when he had tasted thereof, he would not drink. Now, so you understand what's going on here. When they bring him out to crucify him, they get to the place where they're going to crucify him. This was actually a common practice by a lot of the Jewish women, that they would bring this mixture of vinegar mingled with gall. And what this was basically a drugged mix of vinegar and wine that really deadened the senses and deadened your pain receptors to a point to make the crucifixion process more tolerable. And this was a kind act that these women of Jerusalem had begun doing because of some Old Testament verses that talk about being kind to those that are sentenced and near death, and so they had kind of picked that up and gone with it. But the interesting part is, and think about most people that were in this situation would have loved to have taken this and alleviated some of this pain. But it says that when Jesus tasted this, he wouldn't drink it. He did not want anything that was going to alleviate or deaden the pain or the reality of what he was doing, even though it was incredibly painful. And this really doesn't do it just. Again, Matthew's gospel is focused on the perfection of Christ. It's not focused on all of the brutality of this. Luke and John, some of the others, really pick up on some of the finer points of this. But it just says here in verse 34, and they crucified him. That's the extent of that. And of course, we understand the Roman crucifixion was to take the individual. They would first pull their feet together and overlap them and fold the feet down, and then drive the nail, if this was your foot, through the tops of both of them to pin them to the cross. And then they would stretch the body just enough, and then they would pull the hands out onto the cross arm of the cross. And most of us have heard this, but they drive the nails here.
Yeah.
Because it won't hold here. It'll rip straight through. The weight of the human body will not be supported. It's really only if you spike anything through the hand here, I think it's only 30 or 40 pounds it'll hold before it rips through. But if you drive it right there between the two bones, it goes behind the knuckle of the wrist. It's the guy that discovered it. I think they named it after him. It's called the Esposta Esto. But right there, basically through the radial nerve, incredibly painful, but that's where they spike it to the cross.
The weight of the bone will hold.
Exactly, it will actually support the weight of a human being, and the way at which you die on the cross. And again, I'm not spending an exorbitant amount of time, but the way you eventually die is through suffocation. Because the way that they nailed you to the cross was to allow you to have enough room to hang on your hands. And the only way, because of pulling your arms up like that, restricted your chest and made it impossible, along with the fact that all of the damage that had already been done to your body, you already got fluid that begins to accumulate in your lungs, and you slowly suffocate to death as you lose the strength and the ability to pull yourself and to push yourself up against the nails in your feet and to pull against the nails in your hand so that you can take a deep breath and continue to get enough oxygen. And that was the means in which that you died on the cross, was through suffocation. Again, it was not a process that was designed to produce a quick or a painless death. It was the exact opposite. It was in order to try to prolong it as much as possible and to make it as painful as possible. That was their goal in this. And the Romans, and the reason that we know all of this is because historically speaking, the Romans crucified thousands and thousands of people. If you were guilty of crimes against Rome, this was their typical means of execution, and this was how they did it. It's interesting to note that some of the prophecies about being lifted up on a tree and about being crucified happened and were given before Rome ever came into existence and before this means of execution ever came into existence. It was already known by God how Jesus would die. And so it says that they crucified him there, and they parted his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. This, of course, is from the prophetic psalm, and I think Mike Bagwell taught on this Psalm 22 a couple of times back when he was here. But this is Psalm 22, I think, verse 18, where it talks about the fact that they would cast lots over his garments. And there's actually two parts to that. They parted his garments, and this again would have been typical for them crucifying an individual. Fabric was hard to come by in those days, and so they would actually take and cut the fabric and give a portion to each one of the people there that wanted it. So that's the part where they parted his garments. And then they cast lots actually on what it was called in another gospel, his vesture, which was the outer cloak or the outer coat, because it was a seamless garment, and that was what they gambled or cast lots over. And then it was fulfilled that they parted their garments and upon my vesture did they cast lots. So that's the two components there. And in verse 35 or 36 here it says, and sitting down, they watched him there. And again, human nature here on display. Who cares anything about continuing to watch as he struggles and as this goes on? And I think there's a lot of people represented here. There was obviously still some of the women that cared for Jesus that were there, but it's just interesting to note here that they're just here to make spectacle of him and to watch as this is all being carried out. And they set over his head his accusation. Now remember, as we've gone through this, there's really been quite a few accusations hurled at this. You know, the Jews obviously accused him of blasphemy because he said he was the Son of God. When they took him to Pilate, we actually found that they told Pilate he's guilty of treason against Rome because he's tried to tell people that they shouldn't pay their taxes and shouldn't honor Rome. Where that came from, who knows, but that was the opposite of what Jesus had actually told him during his life. So that was, obviously it's all lies, but they put above his head his accusation, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." And it's interesting. Of course, it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin so that anybody that was there could read. And it talks about the fact that, and I think it's in John, that the Jews actually came to Pilate, because Pilate's the one that puts this accusation up written in these 3 different languages. And the Jews come to Pilate and they tell Pilate, "Now wait a minute. We want that sign to say that he said he was the King of the Jews." See, Pilate wrote it as, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews."
As a fact.
Exactly. And the Jews said, "No, don't put that on there. Put up there that he said he was the King of the Jews." And of course, Pilate says, "What I've written, I've written." In other words, you just forget it. But it is interesting that in fact he was. And Pilate allowed that to stay. And of course, yeah. And then in verse 38, it says, "Then there were 2 thieves crucified with him, one on the right hand and another on the left." And this, again, their story is kind of in the background a little bit, but the fact of the matter is that when they crucified, that would have been typical for more than one or 2 people to be crucified. And probably at times there would have been much more than just 3. And it says that they that passed by reviled him, wagging their heads and saying, "Thou that destroyest the temple and buildest it in 3 days, save thyself if thou be the Son of God. Come down from the cross." And again, they're making fun of him and they're mocking him. The fact that, because they didn't understand at all when Jesus said, "Destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it up again." They thought he was talking about himself, which is what he's actively doing right here. They totally missed the point on that and thought he was talking about their Jewish temple. And of course, this was some of the things that they're throwing at him. And of course, understand, and this is why they're mocking him, because in their minds, if this truly was their Messiah, this would not be the position and the place that he was in. Even a lot of people who maybe had not made up their mind or maybe were not convinced, when Pilate came out and said, this guy, I've tried him to find fault for treason, for all of these accusations that you brought, I find no fault in him. For the Roman governor to come out to the Jewish people and say,
It's pretty cool.
"This Messiah that you claim or don't claim, I don't find any fault in him," would have cemented in their minds that this actually was not the Messiah. Because in their minds, what was their Messiah going to do? Exactly. He was going to defeat Rome. He would have obviously been, they had in their mind a revolutionary. That's what they were picturing when it came to their Messiah. All they saw their need to be rescued from was Roman rule and Roman oppression. The Jews, especially the religious leaders, the last thing they thought they needed deliverance from was from sin, because after all, they thought they didn't have any. Okay? And so it says that they said these things to him, if thou be the Son of God, come down from the cross. And again, always in the back of our minds should be the fact that he could have at any point in time. It was totally and completely within his power and within his capacity to come down off of the cross. He could have ended it, he could have stopped it at any point in time. And here we see that likewise also the chief priest mocking him. Again, the religious leaders here doing what the religious leaders do best. With the scribes and the elders said, and again, this is all dripping with sarcasm. This is all from a totally
Mocking.
evil spirit. He saved others, himself he cannot save. If he be the kingdom of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe him. Now, does anybody think they would have? I mean, how much more did they need to see, really? He had raised the dead. He had healed blinded eyes. I mean, on and on and on. I don't think it mattered. I don't think they would have believed him even if he had come off of the cross. Again, their sarcasm continues. He trusted in God. Let him deliver him now if he will have him. For he said, and this is important, for he said, I am the Son of God. For those that say that Jesus never claimed to be the Son of God, and there again are many that say Jesus never said to be deity, that he never, again, there's a prominent pastor in Atlanta that said Jesus never played the God card. That was how he worded it. It was very obvious that Jesus claimed to be God. And again, as we mentioned before, it is blasphemy to claim to be the Son of God unless you're the Son of God. And so this is the only one who, because here again, we have statements, and I don't know how people can get around this. Jesus said, I and my Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Okay, so it's not hard to see that Jesus did play the God card. He did claim to be their Messiah, and he did claim to be the Son of God. But again, they're mocking him here with each and everything that they can think to hurl at him. And this is important here too as we close, and I'll be done. In verse 44, the thieves also, now this is still both of them at this point in time. Remember, there's one on each side. The thieves also, which were crucified with him, cast the same in his teeth. Now these were criminals. These were actual real criminals. In fact, when it finally gets down to it and one of them sees the light, he freely admits, hey, we deserve what we're getting here. This man has done nothing to deserve what he's getting. Okay? So he understands. So these are not wonderful individuals here. These are true criminals that are being crucified. But at this point in time, with all that's going on, with all the crowd that's mocking him, both of these thieves now, it says, cast the same in his teeth, meaning they're hurling the same mocking and the same condescending comments that the rest of the crowd is at the same time. And the only reason that I think this is so important to note, all that's going on right here now, everybody that's standing around, this is what's so incredible about this. Because again, our humanness won't let us do stuff like this. Many of the people, including one of these two thieves that is casting the same in his teeth right now, many of these people will receive the gift of salvation. Even though at this current moment both of these thieves are making fun and mocking. And it shows the capacity of love that Jesus truly has. Anybody in here in that position, and these two guys are making fun of us, and then here in a minute one of them says, hold on, I think I had it wrong. You think we care anything about that at that point in time? But Jesus says, hey, don't worry. Today, you'll be with me in paradise. Many of the religious leaders, not a plurality, not a majority, but many of the religious leaders, many of the scribes, many of the priests will later go on to accept the Lord and receive salvation. If you remember at the preaching of Peter at times, Peter tells them, he says, he's talking to them, you are guilty of killing the Lord of glory. And they say to him, what do we do? How do we overcome that? This is in the book of Acts. And Peter says, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you'll be saved. And they actually come to repentance. God, you mean to tell me that God offers salvation to some of these people that are mocking right here? Yeah. Yeah. That is a perfect display of the capacity of love that Jesus has. Never mind the fact that it's His capacity for love and for forgiveness that's keeping Him there right now. Because He does not, this is the most important thing to remember in all of this. He doesn't have to do this. He doesn't have to stay there, and He doesn't have to endure this. He does it totally and completely for His love for His creation and His love for humankind, so that you and I would have the opportunity to be saved. Because He knows. He's already prayed in the garden. He says, if there's any other way, let this cup pass. You and I know He knew. This is the only way. This is the only payment for sin that is right and complete. And nothing short of this gets the job done. And so, this is the only way, and this is the only way, and because it's the only way, He's willing to endure it, He's willing to go through it, and He goes through every aspect of it with complete knowledge, complete understanding. And this is also, and I've got to close with this is also worth mentioning in closing, and we'll look next week as the crucifixion comes to a close again. Matthew is pretty concise about it. Only covers one of the sayings on the cross. Remember too, and I did skip over it, it's not in Matthew. But remember, there's 7 sayings that Jesus says from the cross ultimately. But one of the first is, as they are nailing Him to the cross, He utters the words, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Again, the capacity for love and for forgiveness. But anyway, but just keep in mind that through all of this, and this is important for us to understand, there's no point in human history where it looks more like God loses control of His creation. Right now, if Jesus is God, it looks like from the human eye and from the human perspective that man is in charge and that man is driving things and that man is causing things, or maybe if you want, that Satan's in charge, that Satan's carrying out his plan, and maybe that Satan's winning, however you want to frame it. But reality is, doesn't matter what it looks like to our human eyes, there's never a point in time where God has ever lost control over anything. And in this situation, there's never a time where God is more in control over what's going on. Understand this. Every single player, every single actor in this whole entire plot that has played out has done it exactly like God said, this is how it's going to happen. And they didn't even know. Do you think those Roman soldiers knew about Psalm 22 when they were casting lots on his garments? They didn't have a clue about it. They didn't even, you wouldn't, I mean, they wouldn't have had any idea what you were talking about. It's still happening exactly like God said it was going to happen. And so the practical application is, even in our lives, even in our situations, when it looks like things are out of control or God, because I think sometimes people, and I got to finish, sometimes people feel like in this day and age, God's so far away and so far out of control of things that go on. God's still got as much power as God's always has, and He's still as much in control as He's ever been of every intricate detail of His creation. So, all right, next week we'll finish up chapter 27, hopefully. Thank y'all.